the bright orange paper fluttering against my front door, its edges curling slightly in the evening breeze, stopping me dead in my tracks. After a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, all I had wanted was to come home, change into something comfortable, and surprise my wife, Sarah, by helping her with her new vegetable garden. She'd been so excited about it, carefully planning every detail, researching the best soil and drainage methods, making sure everything was up to the HOA standards. But the second I saw that notice, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. The words "immediate action required" were stamped across the top in bold, black letters, making it look more like an eviction notice than a simple HOA violation. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it from the door and read through it. Unapproved landscaping modifications detected in backyard space. Immediate removal required. I frowned, flipping the paper over, looking for some kind of explanation, but the only other information was a formal-looking signature at the bottom. Barbara Thompson, HOA President. The ink was pressed so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through, as if she'd written it with the full force of her authority. But it was the last line of the notice that truly made my stomach turn. Security will conduct regular inspections to ensure compliance. Since when did our quiet suburban neighborhood require security inspections for vegetable gardens? I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time I'd heard about Barbara Thompson's antics. She'd moved into the neighborhood only 6 months ago, yet had somehow managed to get herself elected HOA president within weeks. Since then, the complaints had started rolling in, ridiculously strict rule enforcement, unexplained fines, and now, apparently, surprise inspections by some kind of security team? I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures of the notice, making sure to capture both the front and back. Something about the wording felt off, almost like it was trying too hard to sound official. If there was one thing I'd learned from my father, the chief of police, it was to document everything, no matter how small. Inside the house, I found Sarah in the kitchen, humming softly as she washed her hands, fresh soil still caked under her fingernails from working in the garden. The moment she saw my expression, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. Wordlessly, I handed her the notice. As she read it, I saw her lawyer instincts kick in, her jaw tightening, her eyes scanning the fine print for inconsistencies. "But we checked the HOA guidelines," she said, grabbing her tablet and quickly pulling up the community website. "Look, Article 7 Vegetable Gardens, permitted in backyard spaces with proper drainage." She tapped the screen for emphasis. "We followed every rule. We even used the recommended height for the raised beds. They barely peek over the fence." An unwelcome visitor. The doorbell rang, making both of us jump. Through the peephole, I saw Barbara Thompson herself standing impatiently on our welcome mat, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the screen of a sleek black tablet. She wore a crisp white pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her posture rigid with self-importance. As soon as I opened the door, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "I wanted to make sure you received my notice," she announced, tilting her head to try and peek inside our home. I stepped outside, subtly blocking her view. "Yes, we received it," I said evenly. "But I'd like to see the specific complaints that led to this violation." Barbara's expression barely changed, but I caught the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "The board has received multiple reports regarding your," she glanced at her tablet, "agricultural activities." She said the words like they left a bad taste in her mouth. I crossed my arms. "I'd still like to see those complaints. And could you clarify which exact HOA guidelines we violated?" Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Our new security team will be documenting all violations starting tomorrow. I suggest you comply quickly to avoid complications." She turned on her heel, but not before I caught sight of something that made my stomach twist. There, on the back of her tablet case, was a logo, a golden emblem shaped suspiciously like a police badge. But it wasn't any official badge I'd ever seen before. My father had spent his entire career in law enforcement, and I'd grown up around real police insignia. This was something different. Something deliberately designed to mimic authority. As I shut the door, Sarah was already pulling up property maps and local ordinances on her laptop. "Look at this," she murmured, pointing at the HOA board meeting minutes from last month. "They never voted on hiring a security team. There's no approval, no funding allocation, nothing." I stared out our kitchen window at the neat rows of vegetables Sarah had so lovingly planted. Something bigger was happening here, and that orange notice was just the beginning. I reached for my phone, debating whether to call my father. Then I hesitated. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe I was overreacting. But as I watched Barbara stride down the street, stopping at other houses and taking photos with that ominous-looking tablet, I couldn't shake the feeling that our quiet neighborhood was about to change forever. The first encounter with the security team the next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed movement outside. Through the kitchen window, I saw them, 2 men dressed in black polo shirts with HOA security printed across the back in bold white letters. They weren't doing the usual HOA inspections, like checking fences or ensuring lawn maintenance compliance. No, these men were different. They moved with purpose, taking photos of our vegetable garden from multiple angles, whispering to each other as they walked around the perimeter of our property. But it wasn't their behavior that made my pulse quicken, it was their gear. Around their waists were tactical belts, loaded with what looked like real police equipment. Handcuffs, radios, and what I could only assume were weapons in their holsters. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a couple of neighborhood volunteers doing random inspections. These men wanted to look like real law enforcement, and I had a feeling they expected people to treat them like it. Dude, I set down my coffee and stepped onto the back porch, keeping my tone calm as I called out, "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The taller one turned first, his hand resting casually, but deliberately, on what appeared to be a real police-issue taser. His partner barely glanced at me, continuing to photograph our tomato plants like they were evidence at a crime scene. "We have police authority within this community," the tall one said, flashing a badge that looked official, but disappeared too quickly for me to read. "We're documenting ongoing violations under HOA Code 47B. His voice was practiced, confident, like someone who was used to not being questioned. That was their whole game, I realized. They weren't real cops, but they were counting on the fact that most people wouldn't dare challenge them. I pulled out my phone and started recording, watching as the taller man's posture stiffened. "I'd like to see your credentials and documentation of this police authority," I said, keeping my voice steady. The shorter man took a step toward me, but his partner held him back. That's when she arrived. I clenched my jaw, suppressing the urge to argue. Instead, I focused on keeping my phone steady, recording every detail, the fake cops, the smug look on Barbara's face, the way she held that violation notice like a royal decree. "So, let me get this straight," I said, my voice deliberately slow and measured. "You've hired a private security team, without board approval, to enforce rules that don't actually exist?" Barbara's smile didn't waver, but I caught the slight twitch in her eye. "The board has granted me emergency enforcement powers," she said smoothly. "It's all in the latest amendment to our community charter." Sarah stepped out onto the porch beside me, her arms crossed. "Funny," she said, tilting her head. "Because I checked the minutes from the last board meeting. There was no vote, no budget approval, no security contract. Just you, rambling about enhanced neighborhood integrity." Barbara's jaw clenched for a fraction of a second before she let out a forced chuckle. "Well, I suppose some details haven't been fully updated online yet. Regardless, compliance inspections have already begun." She gestured toward the security men, who were now moving down the street, stopping at each house to snap photos. Residents should welcome a more disciplined, orderly community. I turned my phone toward them. "And what happens if we don't comply?" Barbara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped something on her tablet, and I heard a soft chime, like a notification being sent. A moment later, my phone buzzed. A new email. I glanced at the subject line and felt my stomach drop. Final notice. HOA violation fines pending. I clicked it open. A digital invoice. $500 fine. Due immediately. Failure to pay may result in legal action. Sarah grabbed my phone, reading over my shoulder. "You can't just make up fines on the spot." Barbara raised an eyebrow. "Can't I?" She turned her tablet so we could see the screen, an official-looking database listing each home in the community, complete with owner names, property values, and a section labeled fines and violations. Our name was already on it. So were others. Dozens of them. Some houses had multiple fines stacked on top of each other, ranging from unpaid landscaping fees to unsanctioned exterior modifications. "This is extortion," I said coldly. Barbara only smiled wider. "No, dear. This is community management." Then she turned and walked away. Neighbors in fear that night, our neighborhood felt different. Darker. More oppressive. Sarah and I stayed up late, reviewing the HOA bylaws again, searching for any loophole, any way to fight back. But every time we thought we had an opening, we hit a dead end. Barbara had been careful. Too careful. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was rewriting them in real time. At around 11 p.m., I stepped outside to get some air. The street was eerily quiet, but as I looked around, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. Lights flickered behind curtains. Blinds shifted. The glow of phone screens reflected in windows. People were watching. But they weren't just watching me, they were watching the street. Watching them. Two of the security officers were parked down the block in an unmarked black SUV, idling with their lights off. Every now and then, I saw the faint flash of a camera through the windshield. They were documenting everything. The sound of a door creaking open made me turn. Mrs. Patel, the elderly widow from 3 houses down, peeked out. "Come inside, dear," she whispered. Her voice shook. "They watch at night." Before I could respond, she shut her door and locked it. That's when I noticed it, on her doorframe, just above the handle. A red sticker. I turned and scanned the other houses. Some had them. Some didn't. Ours didn't. Not yet. The sticker system. By morning, the stickers were everywhere. Red ones. Yellow ones. A few blue. Sarah and I walked the neighborhood under the guise of taking an early stroll, carefully noting the pattern. Red stickers were on houses that had received fines. Ours was one of them now. Yellow stickers marked homes that had paid their fines. And blue. Those were rare. Only on a handful of houses, mostly the newer ones. The ones where Barbara's closest allies lived. "What the hell is this?" Sarah muttered, snapping discrete photos on her phone. "A ranking system," I said. "It's psychological. They want people to compete for compliance." We reached Mrs. Patel's house, and I knocked softly. She opened the door just a crack. "Please," she whispered. "Don't be seen talking to me." "We just need to know what's going on," Sarah said. "What do the stickers actually mean?" Mrs. Patel hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "Red means trouble," she whispered. "It means they'll watch you. Yellow means you've paid, but you're still being monitored." Her voice dropped lower. "And blue means you're safe." "Safe from what?" I asked. Her eyes flickered with something close to terror. "From whatever happens to the ones who don't pay." The disappearances happened 3 days later. A family on the next street over, gone. Their car still in the driveway, porch light still on, but the house? Empty. No furniture. No belongings. Just a fresh coat of paint on the door, covering where their sticker had been. "They moved out," Barbara announced cheerfully at the next HOA meeting, standing at the podium with that same smirk on her face. "Couldn't keep up with their responsibilities, so they chose to relocate. It's a good thing, really. Makes room for better neighbors." But nobody chose to move that fast. That night, I checked the HOA database through a hidden link Sarah had found. The missing families entry? Deleted. No fines. No violations. It was like they had never lived here at all. And then, a new email arrived in my inbox, mandatory meeting for all residents with red stickers. "Attendance is not optional." I looked at Sarah. She looked at me. We both knew we were next. The last warning at 10 p.m., we arrived at the community center, where a handful of other residents with red stickers had gathered. The atmosphere was thick with unease. People whispered, glanced at the doors, checked their phones like they were waiting for an escape route to appear. Then, Barbara walked in, flanked by 2 of her security officers. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'll make this brief," she said. "You all have one final opportunity to comply. Pay your outstanding fines. Remove unauthorized modifications. Obey." Her eyes locked onto mine. "Or you can leave." The man next to me, John, a father of 2, stood up. "And if we don't?" Barbara's smile widened. "Then your residency agreement will be terminated." John scoffed. You can't just kick people out of their own homes." Her smile didn't falter. "Oh, but we can." She gestured toward her security team. "And we already have." The doors behind us locked, and that's when the real nightmare began. The special security team that Barbara had installed wasn't just a fake authority, it was a cover for something much worse. These so-called officers had been using their positions to case houses for potential robberies, deciding which families had valuables worth stealing. The moment the sun started setting, our quiet suburban street transformed into something out of a crime scene drama. It looked like a block party, but instead of barbecue grills and music, there were police officers, evidence technicians, and news reporters swarming every inch of our neighborhood. Neighbors who had never so much as nodded to each other before were now hugging, crying, and sharing their relief that Barbara's reign of terror had finally come to an end. Sarah, always the caretaker, brought out cold drinks for everyone, a small act of kindness that felt enormous after everything we'd been through. Even the Rodriguez kids, whose birthday party had been interrupted by Barbara's security thugs, finally got to celebrate properly. This time, with real police officers singing "Happy Birthday" alongside them. Meanwhile, Barbara sat alone in the back of a patrol car, watching the empire she had so carefully constructed crumble before her eyes. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing, probably the real HOA board members, who were seeing themselves on the evening news for the first time. Tomorrow would bring a tidal wave of legal action, lawyers, investigations, and hearings that would drag her crimes into the public eye. But for tonight, for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like what it was always supposed to be, a community. Looking around at all the relieved and smiling faces, I realized that Barbara's worst crime wasn't just the fraud or the illegal security force. It was something deeper, something that had damaged us all in ways we hadn't even noticed until now. She had stolen our trust in one another. My father, who had always been a quiet but wise presence in my life, used to say that real security doesn't come from badges and uniforms. It comes from neighbors who genuinely look out for each other. And tonight, we had finally reclaimed that sense of security for ourselves. I could feel my hands shaking as I watched the real police officers read Barbara her rights. Her usual angry red complexion faded into a sickly, ghost-white pallor as she realized that her game was truly over. Her so-called security team, the ones who had spent years terrorizing us, made a pathetic attempt to escape, but my father and his officers had already blocked every possible exit from the neighborhood. One of them, in sheer desperation, even tried to hide in Mrs. Patterson's rose bushes, a choice that didn't end well for him or for the roses. By the time the sun rose the next morning, our street was unrecognizable. News vans lined the curbs, journalists scrambling to get interviews with residents who had spent years under Barbara's rule. The headlines wrote themselves, "Local HOA president arrested for running fake police force," and variations of the story spread like wildfire across every major local news outlet. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, all sending links to the latest updates. But the biggest revelation came during a community meeting my father held at the police station. One by one, our neighbors stood up to share their stories, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of just how deep Barbara's corruption went. The Rodriguez family showed videos of the fake officers harassing their children simply for playing basketball after 6 o'clock. The Patel family displayed photos of the endless fake citations they had received for things as trivial as their mailbox being a few inches too tall. But nothing could have prepared us for what the police forensic accountant uncovered. Barbara hadn't just hired illegal security. She had embezzled over $200,000 from our HOA funds. Money that should have gone toward fixing the community pool, maintaining the playground, or repairing sidewalks had instead been funneled into her private army. And then there was the dog, the poor, mistreated German shepherd she had bought as a showpiece for her fake security force. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when the real K-9 unit officer explained what would happen to him. He had been malnourished, poorly trained, and used as an intimidation tool rather than a companion. But he had been rescued, and now he was in a special rehabilitation program that would help him learn how to be a real police dog if he wanted. A week later, my father took me to visit him at the training center. He was already happier than I'd ever seen him, his tail wagging as he chased a ball across the grass, no longer bound by the fear and mistreatment that had once defined his life. Justice wasn't just being served for the people in our neighborhood, it was being served for every single being that had been harmed under Barbara's rule. And the more we learned, the more shocking the truth became. At our next HOA meeting, the district attorney herself came to explain the full extent of the charges Barbara and her fake officers were facing. Impersonating law enforcement. Fraud. grand theft, intimidation, civil rights violations. Some of the neighbors gasped when she said Barbara could face up to 15 years in prison. And for a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Until I remembered the way she had made Sarah cry, the way she had turned our home into a place of fear instead of comfort. And then, something unexpected happened. People started digging through their old violation notices, the ones Barbara had issued like she was running her own personal dictatorship. Hundreds of them surfaced, and when we spread them out across the tables in the community center, a pattern became clear. Barbara hadn't just been unfair, she had been deliberately targeting certain families. Families of color. Families who had ever questioned her authority. Families who didn't fit into her narrow, outdated vision of what our neighborhood should be. The district attorney's expression changed the moment she saw the pattern. This wasn't just fraud. It was systemic discrimination. When the story hit the local newspaper, it wasn't just about Barbara anymore. It was about how communities everywhere could protect themselves from HOA abuse. My father was interviewed about the warning signs of fake security forces. Sarah gave a powerful statement about standing up to bullies, no matter what titles they gave themselves. And even our little vegetable garden, the same one that had sparked Barbara's war against us in the first place, became a symbol of homeowner rights. As news of our victory spread, other neighborhoods started reaching out, sharing their own horror stories about power-hungry HOA boards and corrupt community leaders. But we weren't just a cautionary tale. We were an example of what happened when people stood together. And as we prepared for our first real HOA board election in years, something even more amazing happened. People showed up. People who had never attended a meeting before, who had spent years avoiding any involvement in neighborhood affairs because they didn't want to be targeted. This time, they weren't afraid. Instead of arguing about mailbox colors or lawn heights, we talked about community programs, improvements, and ways to make our neighborhood a place where people actually wanted to live. The new board's first vote? A resident's Bill of Rights. No more surprise inspections. No more harassment. No more fake security. Barbara's downfall wasn't just a personal loss for her, it was a reckoning for the entire system she had built. The morning her moving trucks arrived, our neighborhood gathered like spectators to a historical event. She stood on her front lawn, watching her once pristine, HOA-approved furniture and decorations get loaded into the back of a truck. The same yard she had fined others for maintaining incorrectly now looked overgrown, her meticulous flower beds abandoned to weeds. Her signature, "I'm in charge," posture had wilted into something much smaller, almost pitiful. My phone buzzed with yet another news alert. Former HOA president pleads guilty in private security scandal. The story had blown up beyond our town, catching national attention and sparking investigations into similar HOA abuses across the country. My dad had already received calls from police chiefs in 3 different states, all asking how we had managed to bring her down. But as I watched Barbara supervise the loading of her belongings, there was no triumph in the moment. Just the quiet realization that she had lost everything, not just her home, but the iron grip she had once held over the community. And the most ironic part? The very thing she had fought hardest to control, the neighborhood itself, had thrived in her absence. Instead of perfectly manicured, regulation-approved lawns, we now had a vibrant community garden. Instead of whispered complaints and fearful compliance, we had neighbors talking, laughing, and planning events together. Sarah stepped outside, handing me a cup of coffee, and smiled. "Remember when we weren't even allowed to drink coffee on our own front porch?" she asked, shaking her head. She was right. A year ago, sitting outside like this would have earned us a violation notice for loitering on our own property. Now, it just felt normal. Peaceful day as Barbara's moving trucks rolled away, the reality of our neighborhood's transformation became even clearer. The new homeowners' council, no longer an oppressive, power-hungry regime but a group of actual, reasonable people, held meetings where real discussions happened. No more arbitrary citations. No more anonymous complaints about mailbox heights. Instead, the focus was on building something better. At our first official community meeting, Sarah, now serving as council president, proposed an idea that would have been unthinkable under Barbara's rule, using our budget for community programs instead of security patrols. The vote passed unanimously. It was a revolutionary shift, one that turned what used to be an organization of control into an organization of support. Suddenly, our neighborhood wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a place where people thrived. A documentary crew even came to interview us, intrigued by the dramatic turnaround. They filmed our monthly block party, where Officer Rodriguez, a real police officer, played basketball with the kids while parents grilled and traded stories. The producer kept shaking her head, saying she couldn't believe this was the same community she had read about in the news. The transformation was so complete, so profound, that even those who had once been afraid to speak up now laughed freely in the streets. The old security office, once a place of intimidation, was repurposed into a community resource center. The gun safes and surveillance equipment were replaced with books, board games, and a coffee station. The only uniforms allowed inside were those worn by our community service volunteers, easily identified by their bright yellow neighbor helper vests. Instead of patrolling for minor violations, they helped elderly residents with yard work, organized food drives, and coordinated neighborhood events. One afternoon, while dropping off some donations at the center, I found an envelope in our mailbox. Inside was a letter from Barbara's daughter. "Mom's starting therapy," it read. "Watching your community heal helped her realize she needs to heal, too." Attached was a photograph of Barbara standing in the yard of her new home, smaller, simpler, but somehow warmer than the fortress she had once ruled over. She was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile, as she worked in a small garden. It was the first time I had ever seen her look truly at peace. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Part of me still held on to the anger, the resentment for everything she had put us through. But another part of me, the part that had witnessed the rebirth of our community, understood. She had lost control, but maybe, in losing control, she had found something else. Something real. I showed the letter to Sarah, who read it in silence before folding it carefully and tucking it away. "I don't think I'll ever forgive her," she admitted. "But I hope she finds something better for herself." And in that moment, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't just reclaiming our neighborhood. It was proving that we could move forward without the weight of the past dragging us down. New families began moving into the neighborhood, drawn in by the sense of community we had rebuilt from the ground up. Mrs. Patterson, who had once been the self-appointed compliance officer reporting her neighbors for every minor infraction, now spent her afternoons exchanging homegrown tomatoes for Mrs. Patel's homemade naan. The Rodriguez kids, who used to rush inside whenever a security car drove by, now rode their bikes freely through the streets, waving at every friendly face they passed. My dad, once the enforcer of law and order in our town, now visited not as a police chief, but as a proud father and soon-to-be grandfather. Sarah's baby bump was just starting to show, and as we prepared to welcome a new life into our community, the thought filled me with an overwhelming sense of hope. This wasn't just a better neighborhood. It was the kind of place where we wanted to raise our child, where we knew they would grow up surrounded by kindness instead of fear. The new homeowners' council even created a neighborhood welcome committee, ensuring that every new resident was greeted not with a list of rules and restrictions, but with homemade cookies and an invitation to the next block party. The contrast between what we had been and what we had become was staggering. Year after Barbara's fall, our story made the cover of Community Living magazine. The headline read, "From Fear to Family: How One Neighborhood Overthrew Tyranny and Found True Security in Unity." But the real story wasn't in the magazine. It was in the laughter echoing from the community garden, in the scent of home-cooked meals being shared across driveways, in the way people now looked out for each other, not because they were being watched, but because they genuinely cared. One evening, as the sun set over our transformed neighborhood, I stood on our porch with Sarah, sipping coffee as we watched kids play in their front yards, no security patrols in sight. "We almost lost this," I murmured, shaking my head at how close we had come to letting fear define us. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with emotion. "But we didn't," she said. "And now look at us." My dad's words echoed in my mind, words that had once seemed like an idealistic dream but now rang truer than ever. The best security isn't in cameras or guards. It's in knowing and caring about your neighbors. And as I stood there, taking in the peaceful, vibrant community we had built together, I knew that we had found something worth far more than any set of HOA rules could ever provide. We had found home.